68 votes to 1. That is the margin by which the California State Assembly voted nearly unanimously to protect Linux from a law that its own members had passed just 7 months earlier. A law that, if left unchanged, would have forced every Linux distribution in America to collect your birthdate, hand it to a government-sanctioned API, and share it with third-party applications in real time. A man named Carl Richel, the CEO of a Denver-based Linux hardware company called System76, sat across from state senators and made the case in person, and legislators listened. If you watched our video on the law that threatened to wipe out 600 Linux distributions in America, this is the update you have been waiting for. The community organized, the community engaged, and 2 states backed down. But here's the part that most people are not reporting, and I will get to it before this video is over. This is not a clean victory. There is a catch buried in the California amendment that the Electronic Frontier Foundation described as 1 step forward and 2 steps back. And there are 6 more states, plus a federal bill still moving forward with no exemption for open source software at all. The fight is not over. But what happened in California and Colorado in the spring of 2026 may be the most significant political win the Linux and open source community has ever achieved on American soil. And it is worth understanding exactly how it happened. To understand why that 68 to 1 vote matters, you need to understand what the original law actually said. Because when you read the text, it is not subtle. In October 2025, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Assembly Bill 1043 into law. It is called the Digital Age Assurance Act. On its face, it is an age verification bill designed to stop minors from accessing harmful content online. That sounds reasonable. But the technical requirements embedded in that law were written for a world where Apple and Google control every device. Here is what the law required. Every operating system provider, that phrase operating system provider, was the key, would be required to collect the user age or date of birth at the time of device setup and then make that information available to applications through a real-time application programming interface, an API, meaning every time an app wanted to check whether you were an adult, it would ping your operating system, and your operating system would respond with your age data. The effective date was January 1, 2027, less than 15 months away when the law was signed, and there was no exemption for open-source software. None, which meant that Fedora, Ubuntu, Debian, Arch, Mint, Pop! OS, every single Linux distribution in America would theoretically be required to build an age verification system into their operating system by January of next year or face legal exposure in the state of California. Think about what that would mean in practice. Linux distributions are built by communities of volunteers. Many have no legal entity. Many have no revenue. The Debian project does not have a legal department. The developers maintaining Arch Linux are not running a corporation with the resources to build a state-mandated API. And there is something else. Something that cuts against everything Linux stands for. The entire philosophy of open-source software is that the user controls the machine. Your birth date sitting inside your operating system, accessible to third-party applications on demand, is the precise opposite of that philosophy. Colorado introduced its own version of the same law, Senate Bill 26051, called Age Attestation on Computing Devices. Identical requirements. And again, no open source exemption. The same deadline, the same API mandate, the same silence on what Linux was supposed to do about any of it. Now here is what happened next, and this is where the story gets interesting. These laws did not emerge from nowhere. Age verification legislation has been a growing legislative priority across the United States for several years, accelerating after congressional testimony and media coverage focused social media platforms and the harm done to young people online. The political logic is straightforward. Parents are angry, legislators want to respond, and the dominant mental model is one where Apple and Google control the devices in people's pockets. If you want to verify someone's age, you build a requirement into the operating system, and Apple and Google, who have the technical infrastructure, the legal teams, and the revenue, figure out how to implement it. The problem is that model does not account for the rest of the software world. It does not account for open source operating systems. It does not account for the fact that approximately 3% of desktop computers Globally run Linux, a number that sounds small until you realize that 3% of the global desktop market represents tens of millions of machines. In the United States, Linux desktop usage has been growing, particularly among older users who have grown disillusioned. Bloomberg reported that Meta, the parent company of Facebook, was among the major financial forces behind the original age verification lobbying effort. That is a remarkable detail. The laws that threaten to make Linux legally non-compliant in California and Colorado may have been partly funded and shaped by the same company that built its entire business model around collecting user data. The irony should not be lost on anyone. When the open source community realized what was in these bills, the response was not quiet. Developers, advocacy groups, and executives began making noise. The Electronic Frontier Foundation published analysis. Open-source legal experts raised alarms, and in Denver, Colorado, a CEO named Carl Ritschl decided that writing letters was not enough. Ritschl runs System 76. If you are not familiar with them, System 76 is one of the few hardware companies in the world that builds laptops and desktops specifically designed for Linux, primarily for their own distribution, Pop! OS. They are based in Denver, which meant that Colorado Senate Bill 26051 was not an abstract threat to Ritschl. It was a direct threat to the company he runs and the customers he serves. He picked up the phone. He got meetings. And what happened next tells you something important about how political advocacy actually works when it is done well. We will get to the specifics of those meetings in a moment, but first, the exact legal language that changed, because that language matters more than the headlines suggest. In February 2026, something unusual happened. Buffy Wicks, the California Assembly member who had written the original Digital Age Assurance Act, AB 1043, introduced a new bill, Assembly Bill 1856, an amendment to her own law. The same person who created the problem decided to fix it. That is not a small thing. Legislators rarely introduce bills to correct their own legislation so quickly. It signals that the backlash was real, that the technical objections were credible, and that the advocacy reached the right people at the right time. Assembly Bill 1856 narrowed the definition of operating system provider. The new language excludes entities that distribute software under open licenses, meaning licenses that, in the words of the bill, permit users to copy, redistribute, and modify the code. That is the definition of open source. Fedora, Ubuntu, Debian, Arch, Mint, Pop! OS, every mainstream Linux distribution is distributed under licenses that meet that definition. The California exemption also clarifies that the word application in the original law does not encompass software that is not offered through a covered application store. This is a crucial distinction. When you install software on Linux, you are not going through Apple App Store or Google Play. You are pulling packages from open repositories. That distinction between a proprietary App Store ecosystem and an open package repository is now written into California law. In Colorado, the story unfolded through direct human engagement. Carl Ritschl met with Senator Matt Ball, one of the co-authors of SB 26051, in March 2026. Not once. Ritschl explained what the law would actually do to Linux, what it would require technically, why compliance was not simply a matter of writing more code. Senator Ball listened. The Colorado exemption language that emerged from those conversations is specific and precise. The law as amended does not apply to any operating system provider or developer that distributes software under license terms that permit a recipient to copy, redistribute, and modify the code with no platform imposed technical or contractual restrictions placed on the installation of modified versions. That language did not come from a lobbyist writing generic carve-out text. It came from conversations between a Linux company CISO and a state senator translating real technical reality into legal language that would hold up. On May 28, 2026, California Assembly Bill 1856 passed the full California Assembly. The vote was 68-1. One vote out of 69 cast. But here is what you need to hear, because not everything in this victory is as clean as that vote margin suggests. And the complication affects you directly if you use Linux for gaming. Start with the good news, because it is genuinely good. The open source exemption is in the bill. The effective date is July 2028, which means Linux users in Colorado have time. Linux distributions have time. The community won that fight. It now sits in the Senate Rules Committee. It must pass the full Senate and be signed by the governor before the exemption takes effect. As of early June 2026, that has not happened yet. The script you saw written about this victory in other places, the ones that said, California passed the law protecting Linux, those are premature. The Assembly passed the amendment, the Senate has not yet voted. The governor has not yet signed. If AB 1856 stalls in the Senate, if it does not pass before the end of the legislative session, Linux distributions could still face the original deadline with no exemption in place. Now about Steam's OS. This is the angle that almost nobody in the Linux press has picked up, and it matters for a significant portion of the Linux community. Valve's Steam Deck runs SteamOS, a Linux-based operating system. But SteamOS is tied to the Steam platform, which is a proprietary application store. The Colorado exemption specifically requires that there be no platform-imposed technical or contractual restrictions placed on the installation of modified versions. Whether SteamOS qualifies under that language is genuinely unclear. If Valve has contractual mechanisms that restrict what users can run on Steam-OS devices, SteamOS may not meet the exemption criteria even though it is built on Linux. And there is the broader problem the Electronic Frontier Foundation flagged. It also expands the scope of age verification to browsers and websites in ways that go beyond the original law. The EFF position was blunt: one step forward, two steps back. You cannot celebrate this bill as a pure win without acknowledging what it adds to the surveillance framework, even as it removes one threat to open source. And then there are the other states: New York, Illinois, Louisiana, Texas, Utah. All have similar age verification bills in motion. None of them, as of June 2026, contain explicit open source exemptions. A federal bill is also moving with the same silence on Linux. California and Colorado are two states. The legislative map still has significant gaps. What happened to one BSD variant, Midnight BSD, is a useful illustration of how bad things could get. In February 2026, rather than attempt compliance with the original California law, Midnight BSD briefly added a clause to its license, banning California users entirely. That is not a joke. A free operating system in 2026 attempted to legally exclude residents of an entire US state rather than build an age verification system it had no capacity to build. That clause was later removed, but the fact that it appeared at all tells you something about the panic these laws created, and the panic that could return in states where the Linux community has not yet organized the same kind of direct legislative engagement it achieved in California and Colorado. The human side of all of this, what it actually felt like to be in the room when this fight was happening, is the part of this story that deserves its full moment, and we are going to get there right now. Carl Richels is not a household name. He is not Linus Torvalds. He does not have millions of followers on social media. He runs a company of roughly 100 people in Denver, Colorado that makes laptops and desktops for people who have chosen Linux. His customers are in many ways exactly the kind of people watching this video. People who made a deliberate choice to step away from the platforms that felt like they had lost interest in the user. People who went looking for an operating system that actually respected the fact that they owned their machine. When Colorado introduced SB 26051, Richel did not write a blog post. He did not post a thread. He got in a car, went to the Capitol, and sat down with a senator. What Richel was explaining to Senator Matt Ball in those March 2026 meetings was not just a technical argument, it was a practical one. System 76 ships hardware. Their hardware runs Pop! OS. Pop! OS is open source. If Colorado law required System 76 to build an age verification API into their operating system, they would face a choice that had no good answer: attempt to build a surveillance mechanism that violated the entire premise of what their product was, or stop selling hardware to Colorado residents. Neither of those options is acceptable for a company built on the principle that software should serve the person using it. Senator Ball heard that argument. The exemption language in Colorado amended bill reflects in legal terms exactly what Richel explained in those meetings. You can see the DNA of those conversations in the specific phrasing. No platform imposed technical or contractual restrictions on the installation of modified versions. That is not legislative boilerplate. That is a sentence written by people who understood what a Linux distribution actually is. It is worth stepping back and recognizing what that represents. A CEO of a small Linux hardware company in Denver sat across from a state senator and changed the law, not through lobbying spend, not through political donations, through showing up explaining the technical reality clearly and treating the legislators as someone capable of understanding the nuance. And across the country in Sacramento, a similar dynamic played out. Buffy Wicks did not have to introduce AB 1856. She wrote the original law. She could have defended it. Instead, she listened to the developers, the privacy advocates, the people who came to her and said, "You did not think this through for our world." The 68-1 vote in the California Assembly is in a real sense 68 legislators saying, "We hear you. We made a mistake. We are fixing it." For the people who have been following the legislative threat to Linux for the past year, the developers who feared their work would be made illegal in the largest economy in the United States, that vote was something they had not been certain they would ever see. There is still a Senate vote to come. There are still 6 more states to fight. But in the spring of 2026, the open source community learns something it will not forget. When it engages directly, when it sends real people to real meetings with real legislators, the system responds. It would be easy to tell this story as a simple triumph. Plucky open source community defeats big government. But your audience deserves the honest version, which is more complicated and ultimately more instructive. The optimistic case is real. What happened in California and Colorado represents genuine documented political change driven by direct community engagement. The exemption language is legally specific and technically grounded. It was written by people who understood what open source actually means, not by people approximating a definition. The 68-1 vote in the California assemblies suggests that once legislators understood the unintended consequences of their original bill, they were willing to fix it quickly and decisively. That is how a functioning legislative process is supposed to work. The model that Carl Richel demonstrated direct face-to-face engagement with the specific legislators who wrote the specific bill is reproducible. If the Linux community in New York, Illinois, Texas, Louisiana, and Utah follows the same playbook, there is no structural reason why exemptions cannot be won in those states as well. Now, the honest version of the other side, California AB 1856 is not law yet. It passed one chamber. It has not passed the Senate. It has not been signed by the governor. The January 2027 deadline on the original law remains in effect. If the California Senate does not act before the end of its current session, the open source community in America's largest state will be exactly where it was before Buffy Wicks introduced AB 1856, staring at a compliance requirement with no legal path to meeting it. The Electronic Frontier Foundation concern about AB 1856 expanding age verification to browsers and websites is not a minor footnote. The EFF has been one of the most credible voices in technology civil liberties for 30 years. When they say a bill is 1 step forward and 2 steps back, that is not rhetoric. It reflects real legal analysis. The same bill that protects Linux may be making the broader digital landscape less private, not more. The meta funding angle deserves honest scrutiny as well. If Bloomberg reporting is accurate that Meta was among the financial forces behind the original lobbying effort for these age verification laws, then the laws that threatened Linux were not simply well-intentioned but technically naive policy. They may have been shaped at least in part by a company that had commercial interests in building a centralized age verification infrastructure that its competitors, including open-source alternatives, would struggle to comply with. That is worth knowing. 68-1. That is where this story stands today. And that number started with a CEO in Denver who decided that showing up in person was worth more than any number of blog posts.